It was never meant to unfold this way. The plan was simple. I drive home next Tuesday, after my last art history final, after the traditional end-of-year pint with my flatmates, after one final shift shelving dusty hardbacks at the little bookstore on 4th Street. But life, in its infinite and often frustrating wisdom, rarely consults the syllabus. A visiting professor, citing a family emergency, canceled our exam. My shift was eagerly snapped up by a coworker desperate for cash. And just like that, I was staring down the barrel of 5 empty days with a full tank of gas and a car key that felt impossibly heavy in my pocket. I decided to surprise my mother. She'd always adored a good surprise, or at least, she did when I was younger. The old Saltbox house was silent when I pulled into the gravel driveway. Too silent. It was just past 3 p.m., but a thick bank of coastal fog was already rolling in from the harbor, muting the afternoon light and painting the weathered cedar shingles in a damp, silvery gray. My key, worn smooth over the years, still fit the lock. The door groaned open with a familiar complaint. I half expected to hear the clatter of her ceramic mugs in the kitchen or the low drone of a news program from the den, but there was nothing. No footsteps on the wide plank floors, no voice calling out my name. I dropped my duffel bag in the entryway and my eyes fell on the shoes by the mat. They weren't my mother's. Hers were practical Albine boots or worn-in garden clogs. These were elegant leather ankle boots, a deep burgundy, with a heel that spoke of city sidewalks, not coastal Maine. They looked expensive and utterly foreign. "Mom," I called out, my voice sounding thin in the stillness. I stepped further inside, the scent of old wood, sea salt, and something else, a faint, clean perfume, filling the air. The kitchen was empty, a single teacup resting by the sink. In the living room, the throw pillows on the sofa were slightly askew. A wine glass, empty, sat on a coaster on the side table. A sense of unease began to creep up my spine as I started up the stairs. The old wood creaked under my weight, each step a small betrayal of my presence. Halfway up the landing I heard it. A soft rustle of fabric, a faint movement, coming from my old bedroom. It made no sense. I reached the top of the stairs and paused, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open gently and froze. There, stretched out on my bed, was a woman. She was lying on her stomach, propped up on her elbows with a paperback held in one hand, her dark hair fanned out across my quilt. She wore a silky, charcoal-colored robe, and more than that, she wore an air of absolute calm that felt entirely out of place for a stranger discovered in someone else's house. She looked over her shoulder at me, a slow, deliberate motion, and then she smiled. "Leo," she said, her voice a low, smooth melody I hadn't heard in years. It took me a full second to connect the voice to the face, but when I did, the shock was a physical blow. "Clara," I breathed, the name feeling unfamiliar on my tongue. She gracefully swung her legs over the side of the bed, placing the book face down on my nightstand. "Your mom said you weren't coming home until next week." I blinked, trying to process the scene. "She didn't tell me you'd be here." Clara let out a soft, throaty chuckle, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Well, I suppose we're both full of surprises then." My mother's best friend from their days at Bowdoin. She was a constant, vibrant presence in my childhood, always laughing, always dressed in sharp, beautiful clothes that seemed too sophisticated for our quiet town. She smelled of jasmine and something rich, like amber. Her hugs were engulfing, making you feel, for a moment, like the center of the universe. I hadn't seen her in nearly 3 years. She'd moved to Boston after a messy divorce, vowing to start over. And now, here she was, lounging on my bed, wearing what looked suspiciously like my old high school lacrosse penny beneath that robe. What the hell is going on? I finally managed to ask, my voice strained. "Where's my mom?" "She took off for a few days," Clara said, her tone breezy and untroubled. "A little trip up the coast with some friends from her book club. She offered me the house while she was gone. I needed an escape. My apartment is being painted, and the fumes are unbearable." I opened my mouth, then closed it, a dozen questions dying on my lips. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice softening. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "No, I wasn't expecting anyone." "Well," she said, patting the space on the mattress beside her with an easy smile. "Now that the prodigal son has returned, I suppose I should find the guest room." She stood, and the robe shifted, revealing the worn, faded crest of my old team on the fabric of the penny, which barely covered the tops of her long, toned thighs. I tried not to stare. I failed. She noticed, of course she did, but her expression didn't change. She gathered her things, just the book and a phone charger, and moved toward the door. As she stepped into the hall, she paused and glanced back over her shoulder, her dark eyes lingering on my face. "You've grown up, Leo," she said, her voice quiet and intimate. "A lot." Then she was gone, disappearing down the hall toward the guest room at the back of the house. I stood there for a long time, the silence she left behind roaring in my ears, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was not how homecomings were supposed to feel. And yet, I couldn't shake the unnerving feeling that the way she had said my name wasn't just a greeting. It felt like a discovery. Dinner that night was an exercise in quiet tension. I offered to cook, needing something to do with my hands, and cobbled together a simple meal of pasta with roasted garlic, cherry tomatoes, and herbs from my mom's window garden. Clara moved around the kitchen with a fluid, unthinking grace, as if she were a part of the house itself. She found the corkscrew, opened a bottle of deep red wine, and poured 2 glasses, navigating the cabinets and drawers like she had memorized their contents decades ago. Perhaps she had. My mother always said Clara was more sister than friend. But sisters don't typically lounge in your childhood bed and wear your old clothes with such unnerving ease. Still, I said nothing, a strange paralysis keeping the questions locked in my throat. We ate at the small table in the breakfast nook, the fog outside pressing against the glass, blurring the lights from the distant harbor into soft, hazy stars. She looked breathtakingly calm, perfectly at ease in the dim light, which caught in her hair and turned it to threads of mahogany and bronze. I found my eyes drifting to her constantly, searching for a flicker of awkwardness, a hint of apology, some sign that would acknowledge the sheer strangeness of the situation. She offered nothing but a placid, compelling presence. "So," she said finally, expertly twirling spaghetti onto her fork, "what was so important that it brought you home early?" I recited the story of the canceled exam, the free time. It just felt like the right time to get away. She nodded slowly, her gaze analytical. "You look tired, Leo. The city wears you down." "I guess I am." She tilted her head, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. "You used to have this frantic energy about you. A whirlwind of paint-stained fingers and impossible questions. Now you seem contained." "Life slows you down," I offered, the words feeling hollow. She hummed, taking a slow sip of wine. "Or it teaches you what's worth looking at." I didn't know what she meant by that, but a part of me did, and it made my stomach coil into a tight knot. After dinner, I insisted on helping with the dishes. We stood side by side at the deep farmhouse sink, the warm water steaming up the windowpane. Our arms brushed against each other as I reached for a plate. A jolt, like a static shock, shot through me. I pulled back instantly, but she gave no reaction at all, her focus entirely on scrubbing a pan with a steady, circular motion. We finished the task in a thick, potent silence. "The bathroom is still the same," she said as I dried my hands on a dish towel. "And your old room is all yours if you want it back. It looks good on you." I just nodded, my throat too tight to form a word. "Thanks." She paused in the doorway of the kitchen, her silhouette framed by the dim light of the hall. "I really didn't mean to startle you earlier, Leo. I genuinely thought I had the place to myself for the week." "I know." She offered a soft, almost apologetic smile. "Still, maybe knock next time." My cheeks burned hot. She laughed, a low, musical sound. "I'm kidding." But the look in her eyes held no humor at all. I went to bed early, desperate for sleep to reset my mind and still the nervous energy in my chest. It didn't work. Lying there in the oppressive quiet of the old house, I replayed every moment since I'd arrived. The way she moved, the way her voice seemed to curl around the edges of my name, the way that silk robe had parted just enough to reveal the elegant curve of her hip. It wasn't right. My mother's best friend. I knew that. But knowing it did nothing to stop my mind from circling back to her again and again. I woke with a start at 2:13 a.m. It wasn't a sound that woke me, but a feeling, the distinct sense of being watched. I sat bolt upright, my heart pounding as my eyes adjusted to the gloom. And then I saw her. A shape in the doorway, at first indistinct, then resolving into Clara. This time, she wore an oversized, faded university sweatshirt, my father's, from the look of it, the hem brushing the tops of her thighs. Her hair was down, beautifully messy, as if she'd fallen asleep on the couch and had wandered in, still caught somewhere between dream and reality. "Sorry," she whispered, her voice husky with sleep. "I didn't mean to wake you." My own voice was a dry crackle. "You didn't." She lingered in the doorway. "I think I left my phone charger in here when I was reading." I gestured vaguely toward the nightstand. "It's still there." She padded into the room, her bare feet silent on the old floorboards. She picked up the white cord and then stood by my bed for a beat longer than was necessary, the space between us charged with unspoken words. Her dark eyes found mine in the gloom. "You really have grown up," she whispered again, the words carrying a different weight this time. I swallowed hard. "You said that earlier." "I meant it," she replied, her voice barely audible. And then she turned and slipped out of the room, as silently as she had appeared. I lay awake for the rest of the night, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, wondering why her words felt less like compliments and more like invitations. The next day unfolded in a strange, dissonant harmony, as if the charged encounter of the previous night had never happened, and yet had fundamentally altered the air between us. Clara was already downstairs when I finally emerged, sitting at the kitchen table with her legs crossed, reading a novel with a pair of delicate reading glasses perched on her nose. The fog had lifted, replaced by a bright, crisp New England sun that streamed through the window. The robe was gone. She was dressed in yoga pants and a loose-fitting cashmere sweater, her hair tied in a messy knot, her face fresh and scrubbed clean. She looked comfortable, domestic, and utterly beautiful. "Morning," she greeted me with a serene smile. "Coffee's fresh." I poured a mug, the bitter aroma a welcome dose of normalcy, and sat across from her. The house was filled with the quiet sounds of a summer morning, the cry of gulls from the harbor, the distant drone of a lobster boat, the gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the ancient oak tree outside. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, it felt pregnant with possibility, like the low hum of electricity before a storm. We fell into an easy rhythm. I offered to drive her to the little market in the village for groceries, and she agreed a little too quickly. At the store, we were a convincing portrait of normalcy, laughing over which brand of maple syrup was the most authentic, bumping shoulders as we reached for the same heirloom tomatoes, debating the merits of different local IPAs. It was effortless. Dangerously so. Back at the house, we unpacked the groceries in a comfortable silence. Clara opened a bottle of Sauvignon Blanc. "Just one glass to celebrate our successful hunt," she said with a wink, but we both knew it was a prelude. After an early dinner of fresh haddock and roasted asparagus, she suggested a movie. "Something light," she insisted. "Nothing too emotionally taxing." We settled on the couch at opposite ends, a respectable DMZ of faded floral upholstery and unspoken rules between us. 10 minutes into the film, she pulled an Afghan over her legs. 15 minutes in, she curled her feet up underneath her. 20 minutes after that, she rested her head against a throw pillow, her body angled toward me. By the time the credits rolled on the screen, she was lying down, her legs folded, her knees pointing in my direction, one hand resting on the center cushion. A casual, yet deliberate bridge across the space that separated us. I clicked off the television, and the sudden, profound silence felt more deafening than the film's entire score. She didn't move. "Can I ask you something?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes, luminous in the dim light from the hallway, met mine. "Of course." "Why here?" I asked, the question feeling monumental. "Of all the places you could go to escape some paint fumes, why this house?" She let out a long, slow breath, her gaze drifting toward the darkened window. "Because it's quiet," she began softly. "Because it smells like old books and my best friend's lavender soap. Because your mother still keeps the emergency candles in the same drawer in the sideboard. Because I missed it." I waited, knowing there was more. She turned her head, her eyes locking onto mine again. "And because being here, it makes me feel like I haven't completely lost the plot of my own life." She paused, and the air crackled. "And maybe," she added, her voice dropping even lower, "because I had a feeling you might show up eventually." The admission hung between us, potent and irreversible. "You knew I was coming home early?" "No," she said, a faint smile touching her lips. "But I hoped." She stood up then, the spell broken. She gracefully gathered our empty wine glasses from the coffee table. "I'll get these. I can help." She looked back at me from the doorway of the living room. "It's okay," she said. "I like the quiet." I watched her walk away, her slender frame silhouetted against the hall light, the deep darkness of the house pressing in around her. I remained on the couch for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing, replaying her last words over and over. She hadn't just been waiting for a refuge. She had been waiting for me. Sleep was a foreign country that night. I couldn't seem to find my passport. My thoughts were a tangled mess of her words, her scent, the look in her eyes, the way she inhabited the space around her with such quiet confidence. Around 2 a.m., I finally surrendered and made my way downstairs for a glass of water, my bare feet padding softly on the cool, worn floorboards. I rounded the corner into the kitchen and stopped dead. She was there, leaning against the counter, bathed in the ethereal glow of the moonlight pouring through the window over the sink. She was wearing nothing but one of my mother's old, oversized button-down shirts. It was unbuttoned at the collar, and the sheer fabric did little to hide the silhouette of her body beneath. It fell to just below her hips, leaving her long legs entirely bare, gleaming like marble in the pale light. Can't sleep? She asked, her voice a soft murmur that seemed to merge with the sound of the crickets outside. Not really. She moved to the cupboard, poured a glass of water from the pitcher in the fridge without my having to ask, and handed it to me. Her fingers deliberately brushed against mine as I took it, a touch that was both fleeting and electric. I took a long drink, the cold water doing nothing to quell the fire in my veins. Are you all right, Leo? She asked, her gaze steady and unwavering. I could only manage a nod, my voice having abandoned me. She took a small step closer, closing the distance between us until I could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Her voice was a bare whisper, meant only for me. There are things we spend years of our lives just thinking about, fantasizing about. And then one night, for no reason at all, the moment is just there. She held my gaze for another heartbeat, a universe of meaning passing between us. Then she stepped back, turned, and disappeared down the hall into the darkness. I stood rooted to the spot in the moonlit kitchen, the cold glass trembling in my hand, the air around me buzzing with something dangerous, something irreversible. We had crossed a line. And we hadn't even touched. The following day was heavy with a heat that was unusual for the Maine coast, a thick, humid stillness that clung to the skin. Clara suggested a walk before the afternoon became unbearable, and I agreed immediately, not even asking where we were going. We wandered through the familiar lanes of our small town, where the colonial houses stood shoulder to shoulder and old fishermen still mended nets on their porches. But the world outside our bubble seemed to fade away. It was as if we were moving through a dream, the only reality being the sound of our own footsteps on the cracked pavement and the rustle of the sea breeze in the tall pines. She walked a half step ahead of me, wearing a simple white tank top and linen shorts, a pair of dark sunglasses concealing her eyes. Every so often, however, she would glance back, and the look she gave me was not the warm, familial smile of my mother's friend, but something far more potent and knowing. When we reached the bluff overlooking the rocky coastline, she sat on a weathered wooden bench, swept her dark hair off her neck, and tilted her face to the sun. I used to come here with your mother, she said, her voice wistful. When we were about your age. We'd sit right here and make all sorts of promises to the ocean that we had no intention of keeping. I sat beside her, the heat from the sun warmed wood seeping into my jeans. What kind of promises? A sad smile touched her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. The kind you make before life has shown you who you really are. She turned to face me fully, her expression serious. Have you figured that out yet, Leo? Who you are? I shrugged, looking out at the endless blue horizon. Some days I think I'm getting close. Other days I feel like I'm on a different planet entirely. She laughed, a soft, gentle sound. That sounds about right. The walk back was mostly silent, but it was a silence full of weight and understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the precipice on which we stood. That evening, she made simple BLTs for dinner. No wine this time. Just 2 bottles of Mexican Coke and the low, melancholic hum of a cello suite playing from a small speaker in the living room. It almost felt normal, a comfortable domesticity settling over us as we ate in the kitchen. But it was a fragile piece, easily broken. After, she put on a movie, an old black and white melodrama I'd never heard of, filled with long, smoldering glances and unspoken passions. I took my usual spot on the far end of the couch. This time, she sat in the middle, not directly next to me, but close enough that the space between us felt electric. Halfway through, she draped a thick wool blanket over both our laps, a shared tent of warmth and intimacy. When I shifted my weight, my knee brushed against hers. She didn't pull away. Neither did I. The film's final, tragic scene faded to black, the credits rolled, and the room fell silent save for the sound of our breathing. I turned to say something, anything, to shatter the spell that had fallen over us. But she was already looking at me, her face soft in the gloom, her eyes wide and unafraid. And then, with a slow, deliberate grace, she leaned in. It wasn't rushed or urgent, it was a decision, a destination she had been moving toward all along. Our lips met, and it felt less like a kiss and more like a question being answered. Yes to the current that had been pulling us together for days. Yes to the sleepless nights and restless thoughts. Yes to the forbidden desire we had both finally stopped pretending we didn't feel. The kiss was not wild or messy. It was quiet, deep, and intentional. Her hand came up to cup the side of my neck, her thumb tracing the line of my jaw with an agonizing tenderness. In that moment, the world dissolved. My mother, the house, the silent judgment of the town, the rules we were shattering, it all vanished. All that existed was the warmth of her breath on my face and the steady, synchronous rhythm of our hearts. When we finally pulled apart, our foreheads rested against each other. "This can't mean anything," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know," I lied. "It was just the moment." "Yeah," she breathed. But it didn't feel like just a moment. It felt like the destination we'd been traveling toward since I first walked through that door. She stood slowly, pulling the blanket from her lap and letting it fall to the couch. She looked down at me, her expression a complex mixture of longing and regret. "I need to go to sleep," she said softly. I could only nod, not trusting my own voice. She paused in the doorway, a silhouette against the hall light. "Good night, Leo." "Good night, Clara." She walked up the stairs, and once again, I sat alone in the dark, the ghost of her kiss a live wire on my lips. I had no idea what tomorrow would bring. I only knew that we had finally, irrevocably, gone too far to ever go back. The next morning, the world outside was shrouded in a soft, gray mist. The light that filtered through the curtains was gentle and apologetic, as if trying not to disturb the fragile peace within the house. I stayed in bed long after I woke, listening. The faint, rhythmic clink of a spoon against a ceramic mug told me Clara was already awake downstairs. I dressed slowly, pulling on a clean t-shirt and jeans, my movements heavy with a sense of impending loss. When I entered the kitchen, she was standing with her back to me, looking out the window over the sink, tying her dark hair into a loose knot at the nape of her neck. She wore a simple, heather-gray t-shirt that I now recognized as one of mine. On the counter sat 2 mugs of coffee, steam rising from them like twin ghosts. "Morning," she said, her voice quiet, not turning around. "Morning." She finally faced me, her expression carefully neutral, and slid one of the mugs across the smooth granite of the island. "Figured you'd need this." I took it, grateful for the solid warmth between my palms. Whatever fire had existed between us the night before had cooled to embers, banked and hidden away. "Did you sleep okay?" she asked. "Eventually," I said. She gave a small, sad nod. "Good." A long, heavy silence stretched between us, filled only by the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Then she said it, her voice so soft I wasn't sure I was meant to hear. "I'm leaving today." The words landed with a physical weight, heavier than I'd anticipated. "Oh," I managed, my voice flat and empty. "That soon?" "Your mom is coming back this evening." She decided to cut the trip short. Of course she was. The universe, it seemed, had a flair for dramatic timing. We moved through the rest of the morning like actors in a play we hadn't rehearsed, going through the motions of a final day. We made toast. We engaged in meaningless small talk about the weather. We folded a load of laundry together, our hands occasionally brushing, each touch a small, painful reminder of what had passed. Every moment felt like a performance, a shared pretense that nothing profound had happened, even as the knowledge of it hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Around noon, I found her in the living room, sitting in the armchair by the window, the half-read book resting in her lap. "I've been thinking," she said without looking up as I entered, "about last night." I froze in the doorway, my heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. She finally lifted her gaze to meet mine. "I don't regret it, Leo. Not for a second. But I think we both got caught up in something." "It felt real," I countered, my voice stronger than I expected. She offered a melancholy smile. "It was powerful. But that doesn't necessarily make it right." I sat on the edge of the sofa across from her. "It didn't feel wrong." "No, it didn't," she agreed softly, her eyes searching my face. "And that's what terrifies me." She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, her expression earnest. "This house, for me, it's always been a sanctuary. A memory box. Safe, warm, untouched by all the mistakes I made in my own life. And then you were here, grown and quiet and kind. And being with you, it felt like I was reaching back for a version of myself I thought I'd lost forever." I didn't know what to say to that. "You deserve someone," she continued, her voice trembling slightly, "who isn't trying to find their past in you. That's not what this was." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a deep, aching sadness. "Isn't it?" That night, the air itself felt heavy, charged with unspoken goodbyes. A light rain began to fall, tapping a gentle, mournful rhythm against the window panes. I retreated to my room early, leaving the lights off, watching the rain trace paths down the glass. I replayed the last few days in my mind, the memory of her lips, her touch, still a vivid ache in my chest. At some point, long after midnight, I heard the floorboards creak in the hall, followed by 3 soft, hesitant taps on my door. I opened it, and she was there. No robe, no pretense. Just Clara in a simple tank top and worn pajama pants, her hair undone, her eyes tired but clear. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly. I stepped aside. She didn't turn on the light but walked over and sat on the edge of my bed, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she stared at the floor. "I wasn't going to do this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I told myself not to. But I couldn't sleep. And I didn't want our last conversation to be that." I sat down beside her, closer this time, our shoulders almost touching. She turned to face me in the darkness. "This ends tomorrow," she stated, a simple fact. "But I don't want it to end as if it never mattered." "It mattered," I whispered, the admission a painful relief. "More than you know." She reached out then and took my hand, her fingers warm and steady, lacing through mine. We lay back on the bed slowly, fully clothed, our hands still clasped between us. There was no desperation, no rush of passion, just a quiet, shared presence. Just two people adrift in the night, holding on to a connection they both knew was fleeting. No promises were made, no future was planned. There was only the rain, the darkness, and a silent, mutual understanding. The first light of morning was soft and gray, casting pale stripes across the wall. I woke before she did, her breath a slow, even whisper against my neck. Her head was resting on my shoulder, her arm draped across my chest as if it had found its rightful place. For one selfish, perfect moment, I closed my eyes and allowed myself to pretend that this was a beginning, not an ending. She stirred a few minutes later, her eyelids fluttering open. She blinked slowly as she registered where she was, who she was with. A flicker of something, regret? Surprise? Crossed her features, but she didn't pull away. Not right away. "Morning," she whispered. "Hey." We lay there like that for a long time, in the quiet aftermath, the space between us filled with all the things we would never say. Finally, with a sigh, she sat up, pushing her tangled hair away from her face. "I should pack." I nodded, the finality of it a dull ache in my chest. "Yeah." She looked down at me for one last, long second, her eyes tracing the contours of my face. "Thank you," she said softly, "for letting me be human." That line burrowed deep into my heart. She slipped out of the room without another word. Downstairs, the house had reverted to its normal state, cleansed of our secret. Her packed suitcase stood by the front door. Her car keys rested in the ceramic bowl on the hall table. The coffee was brewed, but there was only one mug on the counter this time. The air was different, thin and sharp. Everything that needed to be said had been said in the dark. Now, there was only the leaving. When the notification on her phone signaled the arrival of her taxi, she called my name softly from the hall. I walked out to find her standing in the open doorway, the damp, cool air of the morning swirling around her. Her fingers were curled tightly around the handle of her suitcase. "Your mother can never know about this," she said, her voice firm. It wasn't a question. "I know." She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor before meeting mine again. "This was never supposed to happen. But I want you to know, I don't regret it." "Neither do I." A small, sad smile touched her lips, one that held both gratitude and grief. "I hope," she said, her voice catching slightly, "that someday when you think back on this, it makes you feel strong. Not confused." I didn't answer, because I honestly didn't know how I would feel. Not yet. She leaned in and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to my cheek. It was not romantic, not platonic, but something else entirely. A final, silent acknowledgement. Then she turned and walked out the door, pulling her suitcase behind her. I stood in the entryway long after the sound of the car had faded down the road, leaving only the dripping of rain from the eaves. The silence of the house rushed back in, louder and emptier than ever before. I wandered back upstairs to my room. It was neat, the bed made empty. Except for a single, folded silk scarf lying on the corner of the mattress. Hers. A deep shade of burgundy. Forgotten accidentally. Or perhaps not. I picked it up and sat on the bed, the fabric cool and smooth against my skin. It smelled faintly of her. Jasmine and amber. The scent of a memory already beginning to fade. I had come home early for a surprise and had found one I never could have imagined. I had left a boy and had returned something else entirely. Some stories don't end in a dramatic blaze. Some end in silence, with the quiet, persistent ache of knowing what almost was, and what could never be.